Welcome to Clean Water Act 101. Today's live session is going to be presented by Lisa Perras Gordon. Lisa has worked at EPA Region 4 for 35 years. For the first 15, she was an inspector and enforcement officer. Since 2000, she has been in the Water Quality Standards Program, working with states and tribes to develop criteria to protect water quality. She currently serves as EPA's National Technical Expert on the impacts of hydrologic alteration under the Clean Water Act. Lisa has 2 grown children and lives in Decatur with her husband, who she met while doing hazardous waste inspections. So Lisa, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can start presenting your presentation whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Yes, I have to say that those early days of hazardous waste were pretty romantic. I think there was a lot of romance in the air as we were cleaning up the Southeast. But that was under RCRA, and today we're talking about the Clean Water Act. And despite having met my husband doing RCRA inspections, as we'll talk about today, the Clean Water Act really is one of my favorite statutes that the agency works under. So I'm super excited to be here today. And I'm probably one of the people that's actually glad that we're virtual, because when we were scheduled to be at Unicoi, I was up against Turtles of Georgia as the competing session. And I don't know, I would probably go to Turtles of Georgia versus Clean Water Act. So, I so appreciate everybody being here and wanting to learn more about this. This is typically a week-long class, and we're gonna kind of blow through it in about 35, 40 minutes. Okay, hold on. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Clean Water Act and Clean Water Act programs. And we're going to talk about the evolution of the Act, where it's been, where it's going, and what that might mean for you guys as Adopt a Stream volunteers and for the work that you're doing. We are going to talk about what makes the Clean Water Act such a great statute and why it has really stood the test of time. And then we're going to talk about just a little teaser. I do want to mention as we go through this and as we talk about the Clean Water Act's evolution, I want to mention where Adopt a Stream of Georgia was just recently mentioned in a recent publication that I worked on. And definitely, I don't like to ever give a talk where I don't talk about the economic and environmental successes of the Clean Water Act. We focus a lot on the environmental part, but the economic part of it is really interesting, and it's something that all of you should feel invested in as you work to protect rivers and streams in Georgia or South Carolina. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on now in this administration and a new bipartisan Clean Water Act amendment. So with that, EPA is about to turn 50. So the agency is a bit of a young agency. EPA and NOAA were both created in 1970, and that makes us one of the youngest agencies that's out there. Even NASA, space exploration, was done 12 years before the environment, which is kind of funny to think about the priorities of the nation. But big agencies like Bureau of Land Management and National Park Service were done well before we started talking about protecting the environment, with the Park Service being in more of the era of Teddy Roosevelt. Bureau of Reclamation was 1902, and then USGS and Fish and Wildlife were in the 1800s. And the Army Corps of Engineers was actually created in part by George Washington. So actually going back to the founding fathers. And I say all that just to kind of put in perspective how recently we've started working on all of these issues. And it's kind of fascinating. I feel very privileged, having been at EPA for 35 years, that I've been there actually for 35 out of the 50 years. And we actually, when I started, had a great opportunity to actually work quite a bit with the founding members who came from other agencies to create EPA. And so one of the super cool things about EPA is our history is young. So when some of the last two founding members just retired, some of our new staff who are 20-somethings who were born in the 90s could actually go to the retirement parties of these founding members. And so you can actually reach back and really hear our history and kind of know what we've done. And so I think that's a part that I really very much love about the agency, is the history is kind of knowable and new. So EPA implements 7 major acts. If you talk to somebody at EPA, they are working under one of these statutes, or they are working in something associated with one of these statutes. As a federal agency, we can only act in manners that Congress has authorized us to act. So, and I think people think that it's all over the board, but really it's these major 7 statutes that we work on, as well as some things like NEPA. But FIFRA, the Clean Air Act, which is really the sister program to the Clean Water Act, done around the same time. TSCA, that does PCBs. RCRA, that's hazardous waste. CERCLA, Superfund, Safe Drinking Water Act, and then the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which is known as the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act, because we're such a new agency, didn't start with EPA and the Clean Water Act. There was quite a bit that came before us. And so as early as the 1800s, the country was starting to really notice the degrading of rivers and streams, and it really was alarming to a lot of folks. And so Congress started passing as early as 1899, the Rivers and Harbor Act. And then in the 40s and the 50s, the Water Pollution Control Act and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act in 56. There's a picture of Edmund Muskie out of Maine. You know, people talk about Rachel Carson and a lot of other folks, and Edmund Muskie is another one of those leaders that was in that time frame that may or may not get as much credit as he deserves. But this is a picture of him with the Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, in the early 1960s. And I bring that up because the Water Quality Act of 1965 was actually run by the Department of Interior. So our file room is filled at EPA with all these files from the 50s and the 60s, where some of the early actions took place, but they were all done by the Department of Interior. So the Clean Water Act, as we know it now, came into being as amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act in 1972. It's been amended twice, one in 1977 and 87. And most of those amendments were to adjust funding, because we were doing a lot of stuff with paying states for different things, which we'll talk about. But it was interesting. So Edmund Muskie is the guy who did introduce this in 1971. And it was passed by the House and Senate October 1972. And it was vetoed by Nixon in 1972. Now, this is where I feel like we've really got to have these good talking points for dinner parties. You know, it's like a lot of people give Nixon credit for a lot of things related to the environment because things happened under his administration. And he did create EPA, and Nixon has some of the most amazing letters that you've ever seen, Nixon's environmental letters to Congress from the early 70s, where he even talks about climate change. But he did veto the Clean Water Act. So make sure you correct all your friends when they think he passed it at dinner parties. But it was overridden in the Senate and in the House very quickly, later that same day by the Senate, and the very following day by the House. I think everybody knew the veto was coming, and I kind of think by reading some of the history that Nixon knew that it would be overridden. So I think he felt like it was, he could get credit for the veto and then still have it pass. So here's the overview. This is off of EPA's main webpage about what EPA captures as the main things of the Clean Water Act amendments back then. It established the basic structure for regulating pollutant discharges. It set wastewater standards for industry, and it set water quality standards. Now, in the earlier acts in '65, they were already setting water quality standards, but this put a more robust program in place. And then the big thing is it set out these permitting programs saying you cannot discharge into waters of the US without having permits, and there's going to be strict limits. And so we'll cover this, and we'll cover how this all looks. But one thing we're not going to cover, but that I did want to mention, is that one of the biggest things that happened in 1972 when the Clean Water Act was passed was it funded the construction of wastewater treatment plants. You drive by these things all the time now. You have no idea, give it no thought whatsoever. But the infrastructure for treating water in the United States did not really exist, and the funding did not exist for state and local authorities to actually put all this together. So the construction grant program was one of the biggest programs that EPA ever did, and it just funneled massive amounts of money. Grant writers and engineers, who were a lot of the original people who worked at EPA, just funneled massive amounts of money to the state and local authorities to get all the wastewater treatment plants built so they could start getting to, at a minimum, secondary treatment. And I think that is one of the biggest accomplishments of EPA. So as we're talking about this, and we're going to be talking about the Clean Water Act, that is the statute that was passed by Congress. It is a must do. But what we work with a lot of, and what you hear about on the news every time an administration changes, is the regulations. And the regulations implement the statute. So the Code of Federal Regulations is on my desk. I have one at home. It's the last thing I grab before leaving the office to head home. And all of us work with these. So for instance, for my program in water quality standards, which is section 303C of the Clean Water Act, the Code of Federal Regulations I work under is 131. This is also a must do, but these are written by agencies. So administrations can come in and direct the agency to rewrite these. And so as you've seen in the news lately, you may see different things that are being rewritten. And this would be the regulations that are being rewritten. The statute stays the same. And then there's guidance and policy. These can look like anything from a memo to a technical support document. These also go through sometimes some level of public process, but sometimes not. These are should do. They do not have the full effect of law. So here is an outline, just really big overview of the Clean Water Act provisions. We're going to hit the high points of these ones that are highlighted in yellow. But I did just want to let everybody know that there's tons of other stuff in there. And every time I go back and read the act, like the total nerd that we all are at work, I'm always finding more and more in there. And it's a really fascinating piece of legislation. So we'll go through goals and policy, the standards, the water quality inventory, the enforcement stuff real quick, point source permitting, dredge and fill permitting, and citizen suits. So starting out with the goals, I'm sure that you guys are thinking, you know, the goals of the act, like this is something that Congress wrote, you know, almost 50 years ago. But the goals of the act, believe it or not, at EPA, we talk about this all the time. We rarely start a new guidance document or a new big set of the regs or anything without always going back to the goals of the Clean Water Act. And this is where I have to tell you that I'm always just so stunned at how the framers of the act got this so right. The objective of the chapter is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. They really had in mind this idea that you would restore the water and maintain the water, but the entire water. In 1972, rivers were catching on fire and there was toxic pollutants going in, but they expanded it beyond that chemical thing to really make it the broader aspect of the entire riverine and water system. So Clean Water Act Section 101A2 has these interim goals. And you guys may hear in the work that you do that all waters are supposed to be fishable and swimmable. Here's the actual language of that goal. water quality, provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water. And it actually says, comma, wherever obtainable. But EPA took this very seriously, so that the goal really became that all waters should be at a minimum fishable, swimmable. And this has driven the program. This interim goal has just really driven the Clean Water Act programs and all of the states. The states have done a phenomenal job to take waters that in 1972 may or may not have been meeting the fishable, swimmable goal, and over time to lift those waters up to get as many as possible to that fishable, swimmable goal. And they've done an extraordinary job. One of the things I love about the Act is, because of this goal, the programs are set up to not give up on waters. So when we try to shoot for fishable, swimmable, if a water is not meeting that, we don't just forget about that water or ever give up on that water. We always try to constantly circle back to it and always see what we can do to bring that up to that interim goal. So those are the goals, and this is a slide that's straight out of the training class for the EPA folks. And it starts always with the goals. And then right after that is setting water quality standards to reflect those goals, the programs that implement the water quality standards, the monitoring, and then the iterative process to check from the monitoring data and information, are you meeting those standards? And if not, how are you going to identify the waters that are not meeting standards and then restore those waters? The Clean Water Act only applies to waters of the US. So if something is a water of the US, everything I talk about applies. If something is not a water of the US, nothing I talk about applies. So the waters of the US has been, as probably many of you have heard, a very controversial definition that has gone back and forth. But I'm mentioning here that there was a recent update. The source of the information on this slide is from this EPA national website. And this is just to say that this has now been finalized. What they did is they updated a definition in the Section 404 regs, and they now have a waters of the US definition that includes territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, tributaries, lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters, and the adjacent wetlands. And there's lots more information on EPA's webpage about what that means, but that rule is now final. So water quality standards are comprised of three different parts: the designated use, the criteria, and anti-deg. So let's go in and talk a little bit more about each of those, because all of the other programs use those three components to implement their programs. The designated uses, the definition of what states and tribes need to do to define a designated use is in 40 CFR 131.10. And it really is the state and tribes' ability to set the goals and objectives for the water. As you recall, everything's supposed to be a fishable, swimmable at a minimum, but you can define that in lots of different ways. It's a function or activity in a water that is supported by a certain level of water quality. So ones you may normally think about: drinking water, swimming, shellfish harvesting, fishing, or trout waters. But it can go beyond that. It can also include things like social or cultural uses as well. And this was assigned directly to the states. This is not an EPA role at all, because what was contemplated, that it was really the states who understood and the tribes who understood how they wanted to use their waters. So we have 3 tribal nations with treatment as a state for the Clean Water Act in Region 4, one of which is the Miccosukee of Florida. And so for theirs, I just want to include an example of a social or cultural use. Their Class 3A use includes frogging and airboating. And so they have to have the water quality to be able to do both frogging and airboating in order to be able to meet their designated uses. If they can't do airboating, then the water could be identified as impaired for that use. And I do also want to say on designated uses that a lot of time the criteria get all of the, people think about the criteria a lot, but there's a lot of power that goes into the designated uses. And here's the designated uses for Georgia. So there's drinking water supply, recreation, fishing, wild rivers, scenic rivers, and coastal fishing. So I'm sure that you guys, as you're out and doing your adopt a stream work, you may or may not have gone in and looked at what the designated use of your river or stream is that you're working on. But I would really encourage you to do that because there's a lot of information in the standards on that. So if you Google Georgia Water Quality Standards, you'll be able to look up by name and just search by name in that document and find the designated use of the water body you're working on. Georgia also has a designation of Outstanding Natural Resource Water, ONRW, and super exciting. Just recently, over the past year or so, the Conasauga River was the first ONRW water added to the ONRW regulation. And if you go in and look at the rules, you can see tremendous number of additional protections put in place for that ONRW to maintain that use. Pretty cool. So the criteria is always designed to support the use. So if you have multiple designated uses, you might have multiple criteria that apply to that use. So criteria can either be numeric or narrative. Numeric, straightforward numbers. Often states will rely on EPA's national recommended criteria, or they can develop them themselves, or they could do site-specific criteria. And Georgia does an excellent job of doing this, but it could be different for each of the different types of designated use if more than one apply. So for instance, arsenic, say if there's a drinking water use, may have a low number because it has a bigger impact on human health than it does for any data that might be out there on its impacts for fish and wildlife or recreation. Whereas dissolved oxygen has much more of an impact on aquatic life, and so you might have a different number for trout waters than you do for regular, say, warm water fisheries. Narrative statements are, every state has narrative statements, and Georgia does as well. And just because they're narrative doesn't mean that they don't use them. They actually use these in many cases to set permit limits. And there's ways to do that. They have translators and that kind of stuff. So on this next slide, here is one of the big reasons that I just think that the framers of the act got it so right. They got it so right because they got that what they knew in '72 was gonna change. Clean Water Act is a really science-based statute. They knew that the science would be updated all of the time through researchers, academics, other federal agencies. And so they put in the statute that we would not rely on the science of the 1970s, that it was upon EPA to, from time to time, review all of the updated science and come up with new national recommendations in the case of numerical standards for pollutants, or new national information in the case of pollution, something like hydrologic alteration, the program I work on. So this process is iterative, and there's entire offices up in headquarters that this is all they do, is they review the science and update the science and put out these new recommendations. And then the statute goes on to say, okay, and then it's on the states that from time to time, but no less than every 3 years, states are going to look at those new national recommendations and put out new or revised water quality standards. So the reason there's still so many people working in standards is because standards are constantly being updated. And our states are really good about trying to get in. And this is a very public process too. The public is very much, it's a very transparent public process. Each of these new or revised water quality standards must go to public hearing, must have public comment before they can be adopted by the state and then approved by EPA. So then the Clean Water Act monitoring program comes in. EPA relies heavily on state and tribal programs to monitor and report water quality data. The data and information is used to do assessment and listing and supports implementation and the effectiveness. How are we doing of all of the different programs that are out there? And then quite often, the data and information that comes in can also be used for states to establish, review, and revise new water quality standards. This constantly iterative process going on and on. Once the data and assessment is collected, once the data and information is collected, it then goes to the assessment, listing, and TMDL folks, where TMDL stands for total maximum daily load. So the monitoring data is used to determine which waters are attaining water quality standards. Again, reviewing it against the most stringent criteria for the most sensitive use. And then it is used to identify the causes and sources of water quality impairment. There's a very detailed process whereby the states go through and identify which waters are impaired for waters impaired by pollutants. So say, for instance, if you have a DO of 5 and you have a process to evaluate the monitoring data and you don't meet the 5, you would get put on the impaired waters list for that. There's also a process where waters that may be impaired due to pollution. So say, for instance, a water body is significantly impacted by excessive stormwater flows or excessive water withdrawals, something that's not necessarily a pollutant, but meets EPA's definition of a pollution. You can also identify that as impaired and put it in category 4C. It does not need a TMDL, but you identify it as impaired. And all of this is done with that constant iterative process of seeing if we are not meeting our basic goals and then putting it all together in this process to then try to meet the goals of restoring that water. And then, as I'm sure most of you guys know, the TMDL is the calculation of the maximum amount of pollutant that a water body can receive and is still safely meeting water quality standards. And so TMDLs are directly in the Clean Water Act to do that when there is an impairment due to pollution. But EPA, as we evolve, we're looking at other TMDL alternatives for alternative restoration options that could also be used. So that's another way that the agency and the states are evolving. So for the implementation programs, I wanted to mention two of the big permitting programs. NPDES is under Section 402, and a lot of people at work will refer to this by Section 402, the 402 program. And so Section 402 prohibits anybody from discharging pollutants through a point source into a water of the US, unless you have a permit. These permits will contain limits, and I will say over the course of the 50 years that the agency has been here, these limits have really evolved as the treatment technologies evolved and as the water quality standards evolve. The technology and the standards have really driven to get the effluent more and more clean. I think the NPDES program is one of the greatest successes of the Clean Water Act, as the states have done a tremendous job of getting really protective permits in place under the NPDES permit program. The other big permitting program under the Clean Water Act is often referred to as the wetlands program, but it's actually the Section 404 program. It's administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with EPA. It issues individual and general permits where there's dredge and fill material placed into waters to the U.S., including wetlands. So this can be anything where you're doing work in a water body. And so, for instance, if you were going to build a reservoir and you wanted to put in a dam and put that dredge and fill material into the water, then you would have to get a Section 404 permit. These projects are are designed to go through a sequence of review of avoid, minimize, mitigate. So for instance, if you were going to build a reservoir and it was for drinking water, as an example, and you went through an alternatives analysis to figure out if you could avoid the impact, and you found that conservation and efficiency in the existing system got you were able to gap your water needs, then maybe you could avoid the reservoir. Or if you were perhaps still did need water, you could maybe minimize the impacts by just raising the water level of an existing reservoir to minimize the impacts and not build a new one. But if it turned out during the alternatives analysis that you did need to build the reservoir, then you would go through a process to mitigate for the impacts to the rivers and streams. Enforcement program comes out of both sections 308 and 309. There is a big program in place that's really evolved over the years to really try to help everybody with compliance assistance. There's enormous programs that are out there trying to help everybody understand and comply with environmental requirements. And this is especially true when new requirements come out. Really trying to encourage businesses to save money through pollution prevention techniques, encouraging them to not create any pollution in the first place. But if it turns out that enforcement is needed, the states would be the one, each of these programs are delegated to states. So we have over the years delegated enforcement programs down to state agencies. And so the states would be the lead for the most part on taking civil administrative actions, which are non-judicial actions, and include something as simple as a notice of violation or an administrative order, and that can include penalties. But if there is something that is more serious, or if somebody doesn't comply with an administrative order, the Department of Justice on behalf of EPA can file a lawsuit in federal court against someone. And we definitely do this. This is a big part of EPA's program. We work very closely with the Department of Justice and have taken many civil judicial actions here in Region 4. And then for the worst offenders, and this is where it shifts from being something that maybe a company did to being something where it was a knowing or willful violation of the Clean Water Act. So we have our criminal investigative unit. They are officers. They carry guns. They can go in. They can execute search warrants. And then if someone is criminally prosecuted, it can result in fine or imprisonment. Okay, this is a slide that's actually more relevant to the Clean Air Act, but I came across it and I wanted just to put it in just as like Clean Air Act as our sister authority. I think is really similar in that there's this constant evolving of things that we're always trying to do things better, always trying to do things new. So, so we used to go out in the field, and there's some analogous stuff for water, but we're trying to get better about how we're doing work too. So this is another part of how the agency is evolving. We used to go out in the field and look at something like this kind of tank and think that we were doing okay. And instead, now we have this FLIR technique where you actually can make the invisible visible. And it's really helpful and actually is really helping to do an amazing job in the air area. There's some similar stuff that's happening now with identifying, and I didn't have a video of this, but which is why I wanted to include this one, is like for instance, they're identifying how much methane comes off of reservoirs now, and they're able to do it with this kind of technology. So that's evolving as well. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act both have citizen suit provisions. This makes them different than the acts that came afterwards. Some of the later acts do not have citizen suit provisions, but there was a very big emphasis in the Clean Water Act on making sure that citizens had a role in protecting the environment. And I've included just a couple of cases here that you can look at real quickly that just really identify how we clarified very early about how important these citizen suits are to us being able to do our job correctly under the Clean Water Act. Citizens are not to be treated as nuisances or troublemakers, but as welcomed participants in the vindication of environmental interests. And I love the language for these two cases, and we have benefited tremendously over the years in helping to resolve these cases in a way that worked out very well. So EPA has made significant progress controlling pollutants. The classic pictures of the Cuyahoga then and the Cuyahoga now, but it could be any river. I mean, I grew up on the banks of the Hudson in New York, and you could put a before and after picture. When I grew up, EPA didn't exist when I was growing up, which lets you know how old I am. But also, at that point, when I was growing up, and rivers and streams were somewhere you avoided. Like if you had ever told me when I was younger that by the time that I was raising my children, rivers and streams would actually be fishable and swimmable again, I wouldn't have believed you. It's just extraordinary how in such a short amount of time, it's such a hopeful story about how much progress has been made through controlling pollutants, and the work that citizens and agencies and state and tribal groups have done working together. And the focus really has been, over time, really started out really heavily on pollutants, controlling those pollutants. But we go back to the Clean Water Act and kind of go, how are we doing? Okay, we did great on that chemical portion of it, and that was really the big focus of it. But really, by the 90s, we realized we were missing the other piece of this biological piece. Like, okay, so we're removing some of the toxic amounts, but like, how are the fish and aquatic life coming back? And so in the 90s, we created a lot of the metrics that some of you guys now use for determining whether or not the biology is good in a water body. That didn't exist in the 70s and 80s. That didn't come about until the 90s. And so with that now, 20 years later, we're now starting to develop some of the metrics on the physical nature of rivers and streams. I have this picture in for this because this is this is actually from the Flint. Shoal lilies that bloom are flow dependent. So if you don't have the right amount of water, you can reduce all the chemicals that are in the water. But if you don't have the right physical conditions, you won't get the native shoal lilies to bloom. So now we're trying to learn all the metrics of this. And it was all in the original framing of the act. And we can go back and rely that all of that information's in there for what we need to continue to protect rivers and streams. With that, we also go back and we look at the definition of pollution. It does include the man-induced alteration of the physical integrity of water. So I wanted to include that because here's some of the stuff that I'm working on a lot right now. Part of, again, the evolution of the Clean Water Act program is once we cleaned up all the chemicals and we're assessing biology and trying to determine maybe why in some cases the biology wasn't coming back, it was in fact some of these physical alterations. So now we're looking at this, and we've spent the last 10 years clarifying where there's Clean Water Act authority. It's a little bit different than for pollutants, but we're looking at how the Clean Water Act authorities apply to this. So many people don't realize, but the Clean Water Act was actually amended just last year under this administration. A very strong bipartisan effort came out of Congress to amend the Clean Water Act. And I mentioned this after the slides on hydrologic alteration, because the amendment was really focused on something that's not pollutants. It is defining and promoting green infrastructure, something that is more that physical stuff of settling water and getting it to perk in. So for the first time ever, Section 502 of the Clean Water Act was amended to define green infrastructure. And then actually Section 519 amended to really encourage to say EPA should promote green infrastructure through public and private sectors. So this is great. This is new, and this is something we're looking at. There was another bipartisan act passed in 2018, the America's Water Infrastructure Act, which really encouraged EPA and the Corps of Engineers to really look at restoring water bodies through the restoration of natural infrastructure. Again, naturally going back to a more natural physical condition of the water body. And it's all in there under the Clean Water Act and supported by that. So with that, we're doing documents like this. This is a document I just finished working with Georgia EPD on. They were so great to work with, and the Army Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife, citizen volunteers, Georgia DNR, and Chattahoochee Riverkeeper and UGA, who took down a dam in 2018. And so this is part of the evolution of the Clean Water Act, where now we're putting out information like this on if you possibly wanted to do restoration that was dam removal. Like, here's how to do it in Georgia. And I specifically wanted to mention this to you guys because we give a big shout out to the Georgia Adopt-A-Stream volunteers here in the section where we're encouraging anybody who's thinking about taking down a dam to look at the water quality in the area where they are considering the restoration. The water quality success story co-benefits, I have a file that I've been collecting for the past 35 years that really talks about all of these co-benefits. I had the privilege of working under Bill Riley, who was the first George Bush's administrator of EPA. And he came to the region and would give talks that really focused on if you improve and restore the environment, you will get co-benefits of improving the economics. And I love those talks. And over the whole course of my career, I've looked for data and information that supported that. And it really is out there. There's a lot of information. Healthy bays and estuaries support tens of thousands of jobs and generate billions in revenue. Healthy aquatic ecosystems support outdoor tourism and recreation. I had to update these numbers from a slide I used a year ago, and a year ago it had listed 6.1 million American jobs, and now it's 7.6. The numbers went up to $887 billion in outdoor recreation spending and $125 billion in state and local tax revenues. There's a lot of economic benefits to rural communities. Restoration improves safe recreation, it improves public safety, minimizes drinking water costs, minimizes damage from natural disasters like hazard mitigation as you're restoring waters and reconnecting them to the floodplain and putting in green infrastructure. So the really incredible thing too is that it tends to increase during economic downturns, and this happened a few times in some of the previous economic downturns. And I think if you've tried to buy a kayak or a bike rack lately, you would really totally know that that's the truth. Right now, when you can't go in anywhere, everybody goes outside. And so all of the things that go into supporting that outdoor recreation economy are calculated in this number. And as the water quality improves, these numbers go up. Tampa Bay, Indian River Lagoon, and many other of the estuary groups are doing these comprehensive reports, really kind of highlighting and putting into dollars and cents the dramatic difference between, like in this report, how much a house is valued on the bay while the water was terrible in the 1970s versus the value of that house, accounting for the time change once the water was clean. These are great communication tools. As you can see, this article was picked up by the Tampa Bay Business Journal. Numerous papers out there, the Outdoor Recreation Economy, which is by the Outdoor Industry Association, which was founded by REI and North Face, do a great job of really saying this is an economic engine that is not being accounted for. And so their publications I highly recommend. EPA had a great publication in 2012 talking about the economic benefits of protecting healthy watersheds, which has great references in it as well. And then one of my favorite documents came out a few years ago, which actually tracked how pollution limits encourage job growth in the Chesapeake Bay region and worked with Harvard to really quantify those numbers. So lots of good reports out there. So with that, I want to really say that as you guys are out there and you're working to protect water quality, whether it's working at a wastewater treatment plant or working as a volunteer for Adopt a Stream, no matter what state you're in, as you guys are doing that, I really want you to know that you really are not only improving the environment and making the world a better place, but you're also contributing to a more robust economy. And so with that, that's the quickest overview of the Clean Water Act. But with that, I'll throw it back to you, Jackie, for any questions or discussion that anyone might have to do. And oh, I did want to give a shout out. I wrote this on my thing. We are trying to collect information. This is a shameless plug for a project I'm working on the locations of any dams in Georgia. And Kat Henke, who I work with at SARP, would be thrilled if you guys who are out and about in Georgia, South Carolina, wherever you are, if you have information on dam locations, obsolete dams, she would love to get that into her database.
Thank you, Lisa, for that presentation. That was great. That was filled with so many great resources. And I loved how you brought it full circle, like, you know, relating it to the economy and just showing volunteers that, you know, their efforts go beyond the environment. You know, it really goes back into the economy as well. So that was really interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
So for our attendees, if you have any questions for Lisa, feel free to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if anyone has any questions, then we can facilitate them to Lisa.
Well, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, we do have a question here in the chat box. I don't know if you saw it, Lisa, but it's from Catherine. And she asked, if you could change anything with respect to the Clean Water Act, what would you do?
Oh man, I cannot wait till they let me change the Clean Water Act, because that would be really fun. Actually, I think that being able to more directly address non-point source, I think we've done an amazing job on point source, but the language in the Act was not as focused on non-point source. And I think that that is something that would be a great change. I think also there's things where by the way, this is all Lisa's opinion. I'd like to say that this is not the expressed opinion of my management. Is that the other thing is there's things where it stops a little short. So say for instance, it tells states and tribes to develop TMDLs, but not necessarily to implement TMDLs. So there's a few things in there where states have implemented TMDLs, but the Act does not go quite far enough to maybe say implement. So it's not a must do.
Thank you, Lisa. We do have some more questions coming in. One is from Betty Jean. Can you summarize the changes that just went into effect regarding the definition of waters of the U.S.?
Oh, I'd rather not. But what I can say is this. I did put that slide in there and very specifically did include the link because I am not the Waters of the U.S. contact, but Eric Somerville at EPA is the Waters of the U.S. contact for EPA Region 4. And Eric would be happy to answer any questions, but I did go through all the materials online and it is pretty descriptive, but I do prefer to not get in trouble by saying something incorrectly since that's Eric's program. But I might, if anybody wants Eric's address, I'd be more than happy, email address, happy to give it to you.
We also have a question here from Veronica. She wants to know what emerging pollutants should be on our radar. Ooh.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on with emerging pollutants, and it's really interesting. There is a lot that is changing. One of the things that you may or may not think about as far as a pollutant is plastic. So plastics and microplastics are a very, very big issue, as you guys know. And so there has actually been waters identified as impaired for plastic pollution, and TMDLs actually developed for plastic pollution. But we don't necessarily have like a national recommended criteria for plastics. But then, as you guys may have also heard, there's a lot of research going on and a lot of outreach by EPA, who is really trying to address concerns on PFOA and PFAS. There's also concerns about pharmaceuticals, which have a really big impact that go through the wastewater treatment systems, which were not necessarily designed in order to take those out. So those are some of the main areas that we're working on, but I'm going to be very interested to follow along and see how the plastic things evolve. I think having served 35 years, I'm really looking ahead, and I think that there's a tremendous amount to do to take rivers and streams to the next level, and I really cannot wait to see where some of that goes, and that includes addressing plastic pollution.
That's definitely a big one. Thank you, Lisa. We do have a couple more here in the Q&A box, and they seem like they could kind of lump them together. So Hannah is asking, PFAS water contamination is a big issue today. Do you think PFAS will be regulated in the Clean Water Act soon? And then Eric is asking, are there any planned or scheduled revisions regarding PFAS in the future?
They have been holding a lot of information sessions on PFOA and PFAS, but I'm not aware that there's anything that would come out of the Office of Science and Technology, out of headquarters. But I don't think that there is, and I can actually check on this and send you anything that is getting ready to be published. Will be they have outreach on what's coming out in the coming year. I'm unaware of anything in the coming year for PFOA and PFAS, but I can certainly check on that and send it out.
Thank you. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Go ahead, Jackie.
That just came in. All right, so Catherine wants to know, with all your experience within EPA and beyond, what advice would you give young scientists to help them build a successful career in watershed protection?
That's a good one. That's such a good question. I would say the answer that jumps to mind for me is to be hopeful. Be hopeful, not helpful. One of the things I go out and I talk to a lot of colleges. I talk at a lot of environmental seminars, and I'm often really surprised at how down people can get about the work that they're doing. And there still is incredible challenges out there, but I feel incredibly hopeful. There's some amazing stuff that's happening. And I think that while things may, on a watershed scale, may sometimes look like things might not change, my experience has been over 35 years that things can change dramatically over time, and that everyone should keep working very hard. And I'm just stunned at the amount of restoration that can happen, and that it can happen in new and unplanned ways. The other thing I would say is that partnerships have become a much bigger way of doing work. Georgia Power right now is taking down dams and has been talking to UGA about that. The partnerships that have been created through so many different areas. Look for partners that you may or may not think would normally have worked with you, but that can be a surprising source of energy. When we just worked on this dam removal handbook, I was just very surprised at the disparate amount of people that came together to all work on it. And so don't let there be barriers between you and businesses or you and industry. Don't think that they're not on your side. I think in the end, everybody wants clean water.
Wow, that was really great advice. I really enjoyed that. Is there any other questions from our attendees? Well, I don't see any more in our Q&A box and none in our chat. So I think we'll wrap it up here then. Well, thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Jackie, I was just gonna say, my email's on the last slide and I can send you guys my slides. But definitely let me know if you have any questions that come up later. When I can't answer a question, EPA and the state and the tribes are filled with just so many people who can ask a question, answer questions. So I'd be happy to farm out your question if I don't know the answer, but don't ever hesitate. Oh, I'm gonna throw out one last piece of advice. People do not reach out and ask enough of their federal employees who are funded by taxpayer dollars. Definitely, you ever have any questions, never, ever, ever hesitate to go online, look up EPA or state people and give them a call and have a good conversation.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I feel encouraged and empowered, like, yay. Thank you.
There's so much fun stuff going on. Like, I'm so jazzed about all the dam removal stuff. I mean, fish are coming back by the tens of millions around the country. It's very exciting. So, and that wasn't on the radar 10 years ago. So, you know, just looking for new opportunities will, yeah, everybody should just be excited and get to work.
Yeah, definitely. I love it. That ends it on such an uplifting, like, motivational note. So I love it. Thank you, Lisa. And yes, I apologize, everyone. I don't know if you can hear my neighbors' gardeners are outside, so I apologize if it's extra loud right now. But we'll go ahead and wrap it up. If you are not already, go ahead and look us up on Facebook. So you can join our Confluence 2020 Facebook group and get all the updates on sessions and registration links. And if you don't follow us already on Facebook and Instagram, we do have those as well. And our handles are in the chat, which Bailey just put in for everyone to see. And we have many more sessions coming up this week, including our Friday night social, which I know I'm very excited about. I will be there. We had one 2 weeks ago, I believe, and it was a lot of fun. It's a great opportunity to meet people in the community and to have fun. So that will be happening. And like I said at the beginning, this session is being recorded, so it will be posted for viewing on our YouTube page and on our website.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jackie. Also wanted to note, as far as the links that were put in the chat, we do have a silent auction every year as a part of Confluence. So please check out that link. There are a lot of great items on there that you can bid on until August 31st. One of our hot ones right now is a stay in the mountains. There's a mountain getaway, but we have lots of tickets and things that are spread out across the state and a little beyond too. So please check those out. We also have a session survey that we're going to ask that you guys fill out if you have the time. It's a quick, I think, 5-question survey that you'll be automatically directed to following this session. We really appreciate your feedback and helping making our virtual conference and our virtual events better and more accessible to you. And then, as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, any interest in getting involved with our program, please feel free to email us at any time. We're happy to answer any questions. So Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone. Thank you so much, Lisa, for this presentation. It was so wonderful. Yeah, and I just hope y'all all have a great evening. So thank you.